Hey guys, welcome back to Code Realm. My name is Alex. So in the last video, we talked about authentication in very general terms. In this video, I want to get specific and I want to show you how you can implement session-based auth in node.js. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to head over to my terminal over here. I'm going to make a new directory. We're going to call it session auth like this. Let's cd into it. So we're going to initialize a new project. So I'm going to run npm init-y and we're going to create a new file. Let's call it app.js. This will be the main file for the server. And let's open this in Visual Studio Code. What I'm going to do for this tutorial is I'm going to use a library that's known as express session. So let's look for it. This one is a library that acts as a session middleware for Express. So let's go ahead and install it. I'm going to copy the name. I'm going to head back to the terminal. We're going to be using Express as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to install Express as well as Express Session, both of those. Once that's done, I'm going to also npm install a dev dependency of nodemon as well as standard. Now, standard is not mandatory for this tutorial, but I like to use it as a linting style guide. So I'm going to use it myself. So let's install those two dependencies. So I'll head over back to Visual Studio Code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constant for Express. We're going to require Express library. We're also going to require session from Express session, of course. So what we need to do is we need to create an app constant, which will be the Express application. And we need to call Express. And once that's done, we can do app listen. So the first argument will be the actual port. So we can go ahead and create a variable for it. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract it out of process env. Just so that we don't have to pass it ourselves, I'm going to provide a default. In this case, this could be 3000. So once that's done, we need to pass a callback. This is just basic Express stuff. In fact, I won't even have a function body. I'm just going to do a console log. We're going to do HTTP to /s localhost. Then we'll put in the port. And this should be it. So let me double check all the dependencies have been installed. So I'm going to head over to package.json. What I'll do next is I'll create a helper dev script. So in there, I'm going to call nodemon on the app.js file. So this will start the development server and also listen to any changes to the file system and restart the server as well. So once that's done, let's do a quick test. I'm back in the terminal. I'm going to clear it out. Let's do npm run dev. So the server starts at port 3000. Of course, there's nothing there yet. All right, so once we require Express session, what we can do is we can basically call it as a middleware. Let me actually look for an example. This is what we can do. We can call app.use just as any other middleware in Express. And we can call that session as a function passing in a config object. So I'm going to do app.use. We're going to call session as a function passing in a config object. All right, so as far as the options, we can start with the cookie object. So if I go back in here, I'll put in cookie. This will be the configuration for the actual session cookie. So we can go ahead and pass the domain attribute, for example. This will be used to configure the domain attribute on the cookie. But if you don't specify the domain, most browsers will by default consider the cookie to apply only to the current domain. So we could actually go ahead and skip that part. The next attribute or flag we could also specify is the expires attribute. In this case, we could set it to a date object, but they do actually recommend to use a different attribute, which is maximum age. So we're going to use that one instead. So we could skip the expires attribute for now. The HTTP only flag will allow us to make the cookie server side only. So this means that the JavaScript on the client side won't be able to access it. Luckily for us, this attribute is already set to true by default. So we could continue using the defaults and we can just skip this attribute for now. Now the maximum age is the interesting part. So this one we actually have to configure. So this one specifies the number of milliseconds until the time when the cookie is going to expire. So we can actually go ahead and provide a time period after which the cookie will no longer be acceptable to the server. In fact, if we don't specify any maximum age or any expires attribute, browsers will treat the cookie such that it's going to be a session cookie. I've mentioned it before. Basically what that means is that the cookie will expire as soon as the browser is closed by the user. So in this case, we can actually go ahead and specify the maximum age. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. Now the maximum age will differ depending on the application. So this could be something like 1 hour, or this could be something like 2 hours, a day, or even a week. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to try to get the maximum age out of the configuration or environment variables. So we can call it as session lifetime. And in this case, we could default to 2 hours, for example. So what I'll do next is I'll actually create a constant for it. So let's do 2 hours. So once again, as I said before, this will be in milliseconds. So we can provide 1000. So this will be 1 second. We can multiply it by 60. So this is going to be 60 seconds or 1 minute. If we multiply it by 60 once again, this will be 60 minutes or 1 hour. And now if we multiply it by 2, this is going to be 2 hours. And this is exactly the intent of this variable. So once we have a default, we can actually go ahead and use the variable. Now the utility of providing defaults to these variables from process end is such that you don't have to pass them yourself from the command line. So if you start the application without any custom variables provided to it, the application will still start. So we can actually go ahead and try to use some reasonable and sensible defaults without requiring any explicit variables to be passed manually. So that's good so far. We have a maximum age. The next thing we could also specify would be the path. Now in this case, by default, it's /, meaning everything on the current domain, which I think makes sense for most sites. So we can actually skip that part. We can use the default /. The next thing we could use is the same site attribute. For example, we can pass strict, lax. We could also provide true, which is also going to default to strict, or we could set it to false. In essence, what it means is, like I said before in the previous video, if you set that attribute, that means that in theory, the browser will only accept the cookie if it's coming from the same origin, or in other words, from the same domain. And this also, of course, has an implication for CSRF. So let's go ahead and set that attribute as well. I'm going to put in same site. We could set it to true. We could, of course, also set it to strict. This is going to have the same implication or effect in this case. Next up, we have the secure attribute. This one is simple. The true value is recommended. By default, it's false. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set it conditionally. So if we are in production environment, then that attribute has to be true. But if we are developing, it's fine to keep it as false. So let me go ahead and create that constant. In fact, this one is going to be based on node environment. So let me go ahead and grab that as well. So node environment, we're going to default to development if it's not provided. And so if that node environment is in fact production, then in prod will equal to true, and then secure is going to be true as well. So this only makes sense to set if you have an HTTPS channel enabled. Next up, we also have the name attribute. So this one could be a custom name for your session ID cookie. This one is actually outside of the configuration for the cookie. So we can go ahead and, for example, use a variable. So let's go ahead and create a session name environment variable. We can default to SID for session ID. So let's go ahead and use that as the name. So let's save the file back in here. Proxy, we can skip. Resave is the next option we have to consider. This one controls whether the session needs to be saved back to the session store, even if it wasn't modified during the request. So for authentication, it makes sense to set that option to false, because if the session was never modified during the request, it really makes no sense to write to the store and waste your connection resources, because oftentimes that store will be a Redis store or a database. It's really not that wise to create an extra connection every time a request is issued, especially if this session never changed. So we're going to go ahead and set that option to false, because by default it's true. And as they say, the default option has actually been deprecated. It might change in the future, but right now it's true. So we're going to set it to false explicitly. Now, rolling is another option. This one controls whether the server will set a cookie for every response. In our case, it only makes sense to issue the cookie if you are in fact authenticated to the system. So if you're not authenticated, there's really no identifier to issue back to the client. So the default value is false, and it makes sense for us. So we can go ahead and skip that. Now, save uninitialized is another option we can control. So as it turns out, the library will create a session for every connection or every request, but it makes no sense to save that session to the store if the session was uninitialized. So what they mean by uninitialized is that the session was created as empty, but it was never modified during the request. So once again, the session will still be created for every request, but it makes no sense to actually save it to the store. So it's still going to remain in memory for that particular request or connection to the server. So for authentication, it makes no sense to store empty sessions. And because the default value is true, we need to go ahead and set it explicitly to false. So let me go ahead and call save and initialize. We're going to set it to false. And then another required option we need to pass is a secret. So the secret will be the actual symmetric key that's going to be used to sign the cookie. Once again, this is used to Protect the cookie against the tampering because the signature will be based on the contents of the cookie. So if the contents of the cookie are modified, they will no longer match the signature of that cookie. So we can go ahead and provide a secret. So let me go ahead and set a secret. Once again, I'll create a variable for it. We can call it session secret like this. Let me grab that variable. We're going to pass it in here. And as a default, we can provide a random string or any sentence. So this will do for a tutorial, but of course it needs to be a sensible value for an actual application. But we'll save it for now. The next option we could also provide would be the store. So as it turns out, this library has multiple implementations for different databases and session stores. So for example, there's one for Redis that we could use. There's one for Mongo. There's one for Memcache and even Firebase. In this case, if we don't provide it, it's actually going to default to the in-memory store. So we can go ahead and use that one for now. Unset, we can skip that option. Otherwise, we can also access the session on the request object for every connection to the server. And we have a bunch of methods on the session like regenerate or destroy, for example. This one will be useful when the user actually logs out, and a few other ones as well. So this is good for now. So once again, to recap, we're providing a few custom options to the session middleware. In this case, we're setting a custom name. This will be session ID or SID. We're also telling it not to store the sessions back to the store if they were never modified during the request. We also don't want to save any uninitialized or new sessions that have no data inside of them. It makes no sense to store them for authentication. We also have a custom secret, in this case a dummy string that we don't want to expose to the client. This will be a secret used to sign the cookie. And we also have a few options for the cookie itself. So once again, by default, it's going to be HTTP only. We also provide a maximum age, in this case with default to 2 hours. We set same site to true, and we also have the secure attribute. This one is set to true only if the application is in production mode. So for development, it's going to be false. So that's it for the session configuration. Now we can actually move on to the authentication part. So what we can do is we can create a few routes here. So for example, we'll have the login route. This is where the user will be able to log into the app. So we're going to show a form with a few inputs to log in. We're also going to create a route to register. Now, both of those will also have corresponding post routes. So the first post will be for the login. This is where we're going to post our email and password. And the second one will be where we post an email and password to create a new user. And we can also create another route. So this one will be the welcome page. So this will be /, this will be the main page, or you could say the landing page for the website. And we'll also have /home. You could also call it /dashboard, for example. This is where the user is going to be redirected upon login. But I'm going to go ahead and keep it as home for now. And finally, we're also going to add a post route for a logout. So this is where the user is going to post to log out of the application. Of course, all of these are going to have a similar, or actually the exact same signature. So let me go ahead and target all of them. We're going to have request as well as response object. So for the main route, we can go ahead and do res.send. We can go ahead and send some HTML. Now, of course, in the actual application, you would send the proper HTML structure with the HTML at the root. You'll have your head section, your body section, and whatnot. In this case, I'm just going to send a simple H1. Let's say welcome. Luckily for us, this will still be rendered properly by the browser. So we can include also a bunch of links. So we can have an A tag to log in if they want to log into the app. We'll have one to register as well. So let me copy that. So let's have a register route. Now, if the user is authenticated, we're actually going to have a set of different links. So we can have a link to home or the dashboard. And we can also have a form to log out. So we can go ahead and create a form with a post method. The action will be /logout. And this is going to go to the logout route that we created over here. And so what we're going to do inside this form is we're going to have a button and we're going to say logout. So by default, this button will be type submit, and it's going to trigger the form submit event. And this is going to post to the /logout route, and the user will be logged out of the application. Now we want to display a set of links depending on whether the user is authenticated to the application. So what we can do is actually, let's take a look at request.session object. It looks like the application is running fine. So let's go ahead and visit it in the browser. So if I refresh, as you can see, we get a bunch of links. And if I look back at the terminal, you could see that currently the object only contains the cookie, but it doesn't contain any actual data. So once we start putting data on that object, it's going to be placed at the root of the session object. So what we can do is we can in fact check whether the session contains a custom variable. So for example, we could put the ID of the user to the session if they're authenticated, like this. So in fact, for the login route, once we do all of the validation and all of the verification of the credentials, we can actually go ahead and do request.session.userID. And this is where we can actually set it to the ID of the user that's authenticated. I'm going to comment out this for now. What we need to do first actually is we need to go ahead and create a store for our users. Now in this case, I'm going to keep it simple and I'm going to create a constant. I'm going to call it users. This will be an array of objects. So the first user object, let's say we'll have an ID of 1, could be Alex. Email, I'm just going to do alex@gmail.com. We'll give it a password. Again, I'm going to keep it simple, so I'm going to pass in plain text. Let's call it secret. I'm going to create another object. In fact, let me do another one. We'll have 3. So ID 2, 3. Let me make it a max user. And the last one will be Haggard, because why not? So let's do Haggard. And the password will be secret. So now that we have 3 users, we can actually go ahead and use their IDs to be placed in the session. So what we can do is we can check whether the session contains a user ID. Once again, if we do a console log of that user ID, as you expect, it's going to be nothing. So let me try to do a refresh once again. If I look at the terminal, as you can see, we get undefined. There's nothing in the session yet because we don't have any sessions saved in memory or in the session store yet. So we can actually go ahead and rely on that user ID. As you're gonna see, it's gonna come back into the picture in a second. But for now, we're just gonna check if we have a user ID. In this case, we're gonna show the link to home as well as a form with a post to Logout. Otherwise, we're gonna show a bunch of links to the login page as well as the registration page. So let me go ahead and paste those. So I'm gonna delete this. And now if I go back to the browser, I refresh, and as you can see, we'll get the login and the register page. And once again, if we get a valid user ID, so for example, I'm going to set the user ID to 1, I'm going to save, refresh, and we see the link to home as well as logout button. So next we can work on the home page, and this one will be simple. I'm going to do a res send. We'll have an h1, let's say home. We'll have a link. For example, this can link back to the main page like this. And we can also have a list. In here we can put a name of the user, and we can also display the email of the user that's logged into the system. So we're gonna go ahead and inject them in a second. For now, let's just save it like that. So now for the login page, this is where we're gonna do a res.send. Once again, I'm just gonna send an h1. Let's do a login. We're gonna have a form. So this form will have a method of post. The action will be /login. Once again, it's going to go to the /login post route that we've created. So what we need to do next is we need to have an input. So let's have an input of type email. This will be the user's email. The name, we can set it to email. We can have a placeholder, email, and required as well. Let's have another attribute for password. So I'll go ahead and put in password. And finally, we'll have an input with type submit. So this will be to submit the form. So this should be good for now. Now for the register page, I'm going to do the same exact thing, except I'm going to put in register. And I just noticed a typo. This of course needs to be required with a D at the end like this. This is the built-in HTML5, I believe, attribute. This will make the inputs required. Right, and the next thing I'll do is I'll also put another input. In this case, this will be type text. So it's going to be the default type. I can skip it. And I'm also going to have a name. This will be the actual name of the user. And we'll make it required as well. And of course, this is going to go to /register. So this should be good so far. So let me go back. Let me try to go to login. As you can see, we get the login page. It could also be useful to put a few links at the bottom. So for the login page, I'll have an href to register. So if they don't have an account, they can go ahead and create one. And I'm going to have the same link. In this case, it's going to go to login. So if they already have an account, they can go ahead and log in to the app. So let me see how this works. We have a register link and login. So it looks good so far. There's no styling. It's a simple server-side rendered app, but it's perfect for a very simple demo. So now we can actually go ahead and wire it up to the post methods over here. Now we're going to need to work with the body of the request, and that's why I'm going to go ahead and install body parser. So let me do npm install of body parser like this. Once it's installed, what we can do is we can go ahead and call app.use as the middleware. So let's actually import body parser. So let's do const body parser require body parser like this. So we're going to pass body parser URL encoded, and I'm going to pass an option of extended set to true. This is the default option, but we still have to pass it explicitly, otherwise we're going to get a warning. So once we do that, we should be able to access the request body. I'm going to create a few middleware options, because if you go to the login page, it only makes sense to log in if you're not logged in already. And it only makes sense to register if you are not logged in already. So if you're in fact authenticated, it makes sense to redirect the user back to the home page. And on the same note, users should not be able to go to the home page themselves. As you can see, I can go to the home page even though I'm not authenticated. So we need to go ahead and put some kind of a protection there. So what we can do is we can create a couple of middleware functions. So we can create one constant, we can call it redirect login. So this is going to accept the request, response, and next. We need to have access to the next attribute so we can call it. So again, we're going to rely on the user ID from request session. So if we don't have a request session user ID, that means that the session object is still uninitialized. So that means we didn't put any data to that session, and that session is not stored to our session store. So in fact, the user is not authenticated. So what we can do is we can do res.redirect, and we're going to redirect them to /login. And if we already have a user ID, we're just going to call next like this. So now this function, what we can do is we can apply it to the /home route. So what this is going to do is it's going to check if the user is authenticated, and if they're not authenticated, they're going to be redirected to /login. So it's going to have a protection layer behind the home route. So before we send the HTML and before we actually show the dashboard to the user, we're going to first check if they're authenticated. So if I make that change and if I go back to Chrome, I'm going to go ahead and try to access the home route. Because I'm not authenticated, as you can see, I get redirected to login. And in fact, I'm going to put the same level of protection to the logout route. Even though it's a post, it only makes sense to log out if you are in fact already authenticated. So if you're not authenticated, you should be redirected to login. We're going to do something similar for other routes. In this case, we're going to call this middleware redirect home. And the idea here is we want to check if the user is authenticated. In fact, if they are, we want to redirect them to the home route, to the dashboard. And if they're not authenticated, we're going to go ahead and proceed with the normal request lifecycle. So this middleware makes sense to be applied to the login page. So what this means is that if the user is already logged in, it doesn't make sense to show them the login form. If they try to access the login form, they're going to be redirected to home because they're already logged in. Same thing for register, and I'm also going to apply the same thing for the two post routes. So /login, again, only makes sense to log into the app if you're not authenticated. Only makes sense to create a new user if you're not already authenticated as well. So we're going to go ahead and put that protection layer as well. So for the login route, what we're going to do is we're going to extract the email as well as password from request body like this. Because we've set up body parser, we should now be able to access them from our request object. So we can go ahead and put some very simple validation. We're just going to check if the email and password was provided. Of course, you could do more sophisticated validation, but this is going to do for now. So we're going to try to find a user. We already have the users collection, so we can call a find method on that array. We'll pass in a callback. So if the user.email matches the email provided by the user, and if the user password also matches the password. So in fact, if we get a user object out of that check, that means that we can actually go ahead and put a user ID to the session object. So this is the user ID we're going to rely on. We're going to assign it to user.id. So what we're doing here is we're trying to find a user that matches the email address on the request and also matches the password on the request as well. Now, of course, this is a very simple application, and on a real site, you would actually want to, of course, compare the passwords. So you would actually need to hash them first. I'll leave it to do, but for this tutorial, it should be fine. And if we are able to find a user, what we're going to do is we're going to take that user's ID. Once again, in this case, this could be 1. If you're logging in as Alex, this will be 2 or 3, depending on whose email you're trying to use. And if the email and passwords both match, we find the user and we set the user ID on the session object. This is actually the user ID that we're going to use throughout the app. As you can see, we check against the user ID here before redirecting to login. Same thing here before redirecting to home, as well as on the main page when we decide which set of links we want to display. So this should be good for now. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to redirect to /home. So if you are authenticated, this is going to create a session ID cookie, and in the end, we're going to redirect to the /home route. And if the validation failed, or if we couldn't find the user, what we're going to do is we're going to redirect back to the login form as well. We're going to do a similar thing for the registration page. So let me go ahead and paste the same statement. In this case, we're going to have a name as well as email and password. So if we have a name, and we also have an email as well as password. And of course, I'm going to leave a to-do because in this case, we want to keep it simple, but in a real application, you would want to do a more sophisticated validation. In fact, the same thing probably also applies here as well, because you'd want to verify the length of the email, the length, and also the strength of the password. We're going to keep it simple, as I said. So once we verify those 3, we're going to try to find if the user already exists in the array. So what we can do in this case, we can call the find method, but because in this case, we only care if the user can be found in the array. So we don't actually care about the underlying object, we just want to make sure if it exists. We can go ahead and use the sum method, and this is going to verify if it can find a matching user. So we're going to have a user object, we're going to compare the email, and if the email is already taken, that means that the user already exists. So if the user doesn't exist, we're going to go ahead and create a new user object. So we'll have an ID. The ID could be users.length incremented by 1, because at the beginning we have 3 users and the ID begins at index 1. So if we have 3 users, the next user will have an ID of index 4. So we need to take the length of the array and add 1 to it. We're also going to have a name, email, and password. Once again, this needs to be hashed. I'm just going to leave a to-do for future. But once we have a user, we could do users.push user. This is going to add the user to the users collection, or in this case, array. And of course, I'm also going to leave a note at the top over here. In this case, for this tutorial, a simple array will do, but in an actual application, of course, you're going to have to wire it up to an actual database like Mongo or Postgres. But for now, we're going to push the user to the array. We're also going to set the user ID on the session object. Of course, this will be user.id like this. And finally, we could also do a return of res.redirect to the home page like this. In this case, I'm putting a return because I want to terminate the request at this point, so I don't want to go outside the if. But in this case, if any validation fails or if the user already exists, we're just simply going to do a res redirect to /register page. Of course, what you could do as well is you could also provide an error through query string parameters. So for example, you could do something like a redirect to /register with an error key. That could be something like error.auth.user exists or something like that. Or for example, this could be email too short. You get the idea. Or of course, you could also flash the error through the session, but in this case, I'm just going to leave a to-do for query string errors. This is something you could implement on the side, but this should be good for now. And now for the logout, what we're going to do in this case is we already know that the user is authenticated to the system. So we're going to go ahead and call request session.destroy. Once again, I think I mentioned this method before. It's actually a method that you can call. So we can go ahead and call it, passing in a callback with an error. In this case, I don't think it's common for an error to occur, but if for some reason we couldn't destroy the session, we're just going to have a redirect. So we're going to do return res.redirect to the homepage so they can retry to log out again. Otherwise, we're going to want to clear out the cookie. So what we can do is we can call response clear cookie. the cookie name in this case is session name. This is why it was useful to extract that name to a constant. So we can go ahead and reuse that constant for the middleware as well as in our custom method in here. So we're going to clear out the cookie. And once the cookie was destroyed, we're going to do a res redirect to /login page so they can log in again if they want to. So let's see if the application works. I'm going to go back to the browser. We can go ahead and visit a register page, or we can log in already. I'm going to try to put in alex@gmail.com. I'm going to put in password. I know for a fact that this is a wrong password. As you can see, the page gets refreshed. So let me try again, alex@gmail.com. I'm going to put in secret, which is the actual password. And as you can see, we get logged in. And I'm going to save it. The last thing I think we forgot is to display the name and the email of the user. And so what we can do here is we can actually try to extract the user from the request object. So we can go ahead and find the user. So let's do users.find user. We're going to find the user by ID. So if the ID matches request.session.user_ID. And once we have the user, we can actually go ahead and output user.name. And we'll do the same thing for the email as well. Now, in this case, we only need to access the user once. But if you had other routes, so for example, you had a route to settings, or for example, /profile, and you wanted to get access to the user in there, so you had your request and response object. If we were going to use that same logic, it's going to be duplicated for every route that needs to have access to the user object. So in cases like this, it might make sense to actually create another middleware. What we can do is we can create a custom middleware. So we can call app.use. We're going to pass in request, response, and next. What we can do in this case is we can have a function. It's going to try to get the user ID from the session. So request.session. As you remember, the user ID indicates whether the user is logged into the system. So if we have a user ID, and by the way, this check is valid because the smallest user ID will be 1. It's never going to be 0, so this check will not fail. But in most cases, once again, it's going to be an actual database, so there should be no concern at this point. So if we have a user ID, what we can do is we can use res.locals, and this is a special object that's going to be shared among the middleware. So we can go ahead and put custom data into that object to be shared between different functions and middleware. So we can go ahead and create a user object, and we can go ahead and extract this logic for finding a user by user ID. We can go ahead and put it in here. And once again, in this case, we're checking against user ID from session. So if we were able to find a user, we're going to set it to res.locals. And finally, we need to call next on it. So this is going to execute before any routes for every single request. And if that request is authenticated, if we have a user in the session and we have a valid session cookie ID, we're going to find the user by the ID and we're going to inject it to res.locals. So now once we do that, we can actually extract the user from res.locals. So we can use a bit of destructuring here. So the reason that this syntax is useful is because if you have more routes where you need to access the user, all you have to do is you need to extract that user from res locals. And of course, if you need to make sure that the user is authenticated, you could also use the redirect login middleware. So you could actually put it in here as well. And this is going to make sure that the user is logged in. If they're not, they're going to be redirected back to the login page. So this is just an example for an extra route if you want to add it yourself. In this case, I'm just going to keep it simple. We're going to have a home route. Let me go back to the home page. What happens is all of these sessions are being stored in memory. What that means is that they're going to be stored as objects in the server memory. As I mentioned before, there's an implementation for Redis, Mongo, Firebase. If you wanted to actually persist them to an actual storage, you could go ahead and connect it to a Redis store. In fact, there's a library called Connect Redis. It's very simple to set up. All you need to do is you need to install it as a dependency. And when you configure it, all you have to do is you need to pass in a host, a port, as well as the password, as you see over here. There's a few other options you could also provide, but these are the most basic ones. So it's very simple to configure. I'm not going to do it for the time being. So if I go back to my application over here, I'm going to log in with the same credentials. As you can see, I get name Alex, alex@gmail.com. It's because I'm already logged in. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear out the cookie using this useful extension. It's called edit this cookie. So as you can see here, we get a session ID cookie. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete it, refresh. I'm going to try to log in as max@gmail.com. Once again, I'll try gibberish password. It's going to fail. But if I try again, so we do max@gmail.com, we're going to pass secret. We get logged in. Once again, I'm going to clear out the cookie. What we can do next is we can go ahead and try to register So I'm going to pass a name. So let's say Susan. This will be susan@gmail.com. And we'll pass in password like this. So we get logged in. If I clear out the cookie myself, I refresh. As you can see, I get redirected to the login page. And now I'll try Susan, add password. And I get logged in. As you can see, I get susan@gmail.com. And if I go to the main page and if I click on logout, this will log me out. And once again, I can log back in with susan@gmail.com, password, I can save it. And I'm back to the home page. Now, if I go back to the editor, we can go back to the home route. And let's just quickly do a console log on request session. So this is going to log us out, so I'll have to log in again. And this is also going to delete Susan, so I won't be able to log in again because that array was destroyed. And now we're back to 3 users again. I can try to log in with Alex. So if we look at the terminal, as you can see, we get this cookie object, but we also get the user ID set to 1. Of course, this will differ depending on the user who's logged into the system. So if I try Max instead, I'm logged in as Max, and you could see that now we get the user ID 2 and we get the actual cookie. So you could see that it's going to expire on November 11th at this time in UTC. So in fact, it's currently 2:41 p.m. in Canada. I'm located in Eastern Standard Time Zone. So that means -5 from GMT or UTC. So that means in London, it's currently 7 p.m. Because we're setting the lifetime of the cookie to 2 hours, that means that it's going to expire at 9 p.m. in London. But of course, I'm in Montreal. If I look at the cookie, you could see that in local time, it's actually going to expire around 4:40 p.m. But using this handful extension, you could also see that this cookie is HTTP only. In production, it's also going to be secure, and because we have a custom expiration time of 2 hours, you don't see session. But if it didn't provide the maximum age option, you would also see this checkbox checked. That means that the cookie is session cookie, so it's going to be cleared out as soon as the client closes the browser. And we have things like domain set to localhost, and we also get the path. The last thing I'm going to show you is I'm going to switch back to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to console log the request session ID. This is in fact an alias to session ID, camel case like this. And of course, all that information you could find in the repo itself. So for instance, you could look for session ID. It's another way to access the ID of your session, but I'm going to save this file for the time being. Let me go back to the application and I'm going to clear out the cookie. I'm going to log in again, and back in the terminal, as you can see, we get this value. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and copy it. So if I go back to the browser, I'm going to open the console. So if you remember, this was the session ID. I'm going to put that string in there. And I'm also going to copy the value of the cookie. I'm going to paste it in over here. As you can see, the cookie begins with S%3 capital A. So in fact, this one is a URL encoded value. So we could do decode URI component on that value. And you're going to see that it's actually a value that stands for S colon. So after S column, you're going to see that we get the session ID up to the period. And of course, after the period, we get the actual signature of the cookie. Once again, I grabbed it using the extension. Of course, you won't be able to access the cookie using document cookie because the cookie is server side, so you won't be able to get it using JavaScript. And once again, that's because of the HTTP only attribute. But because I'm using this extension, I'm able to still access the value myself. So I pasted it over here. And once again, it begins with S colon, which is URL encoded. We get the session ID itself. As you can see, it matches exactly the one in the terminal. This one will be the same for every route as long as you're authenticated as the same user. And also we get the signature portion over here, and this one will be used to verify the authenticity and integrity of the cookie. And of course, this value is obtained when signing the cookie using the secret, which we provided in the config over here. In this case, it's a dummy string, but of course, once again, in an actual application, it'll be a strong value. So this is basically it for authentication. Once again, there's a bunch of to-dos that I left. Of course, we used a simple collection of users. In a real application, you would be using a database like Mongo or Postgres. The other thing is that you would also want to enable HTTPS. You would need to do some extra configuration on the Express node.js side to enable TLS connections to your server. Other than that, you also need to make sure to do proper validation for your input. You also, of course, need to hash the passwords. We store them in plain text for simplicity. Every user has a password of secret, but that's really just for demo purposes. Of course, in an actual application, you would need to hash those passwords. So you could use something like bcrypt, and bcrypt has useful methods to hash passwords and also compare them against the existing hash that you would store in the database. So you should, of course, never store or plain text passwords in the database, but that's a given. And of course, you could also implement some kind of error reporting. So for example, you could flash errors to the session, so you could display them back on your front end. You could also pass the errors as a query string. Of course, you could also, instead of using these hard-coded strings, you could also use a templating engine like Pug, for example, or Haml. And finally, it would also make sense to implement a CSRF protection. So even though we're using the same site attribute, it's only been introduced in recent years and the older browsers don't have support for it. So I would recommend to still implement CSRF for a good protection against those kinds of attacks. And of course, with regards to the store that you would be using for your sessions, so far we've been using the in-memory store and it's good enough for demonstration purposes. But once again, as I mentioned before, you would probably need to go back to this package over here and you would need to look into the different session storage mechanisms and options that you could consider. Probably the easiest one to get started with would be the Connect Redis one. But once again, this is something you would need to do for the actual application when considering a deployment to an actual production system. But as far as the authenticated portion, that should basically be it. So this has been authentication using Session Express library. So hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Let me know if you have any questions down below in the comment section. But this is it for this video. So hope you found it helpful and I'm going to see you next time. Take care.